Chapter 16. Burning Down the House. The summer dragged on. It seemed even longer because little Eddie's mom would not allow him and his brothers to spend all day in front of the TV. She said it would turn their minds to jello, so they looked for other ways to keep busy. The boys usually looked to little Eddie, and he didn't want to let them down. He had a plan. "Hey, guys, we could go out back and dig some deep trenches. Then we could lay boards across the top and put the dirt back on. If each one works on his section, we could connect them and make an underground network of tunnels. We could widen some to be sleeping chambers with holes for candles in the walls. Why, we could disappear for weeks." Off they ran to the tool shed, and in no time, shovelfuls of dirt were flying through the air. They dug steadily through the heat of the afternoon, and by nightfall, they'd opened up the hillside 4 or 5 feet. The blisters on their hands gave them a satisfied feeling of accomplishment. They were sure that by the next evening, they'd be sleeping underground. But the next morning, they hit bedrock. It was one of those moments of crushing disappointment that come to everyone. It just hits harder when you're only in elementary school. Little Eddie looked around at his crestfallen siblings and felt their frustration. He suspected they were beginning to doubt his leadership. He had to come up with Plan B, fast. At that moment, his eyes fell on the impressive heap of dirt that had been piled up. In a moment of inspiration, ready to make lemonade from lemons, he leapt on top of the pile. "Boys, we might not get our tunnels, but look at what we've accomplished. We've stacked up this mighty mountain of dirt. With a little work, we could carve out a crater in the top, make a miniature forest of twigs, and put a model native village at the bottom. We'd have our own volcano." The boys weren't completely convinced, but as they turned their attention to the volcano, they warmed to the project. The crater was convincing. So were the miniature forest and the native village. They stepped back to admire their work. But something was missing. What could it be? When little Eddie suggested red-hot lava, the boys erupted with cheers. They raced to the tool shed, found an old bucket, and began looking for anything that might burn. Of special interest were the containers marked "Caution, extremely flammable. Keep away from fire." They were thrilled to find a bottle of purple art goop their mother used to create artificial flowers. It would add just the desired effect, but they wanted more. It was then Scotty recalled the chemistry set he'd received for Christmas. It was up in the attic. Without hesitating, the boys dashed inside, through the kitchen, and up the narrow back stairs to the attic. They examined each small vial of chemicals, choosing only the ones that would burn, and poured their contents into a test tube. For want of a Bunsen burner, they lit a candle, placed it in a Dixie cup, and began to heat the test tube. When it was bubbling properly, they dumped its contents into the bucket and ran down the stairs and out the door. They poured the mixture into the crater and stepped back. Eddie struck a match and tossed it in. Ka-foom! The earth shook as a blast of flame rose 6 feet into the air. The miniature village trembled, smoke rolled, and in a final burst of glory, the purple art goop began to boil and rolled over the lip of the crater, setting the tiny forest on fire. It was sensational, and the boys reveled in their triumph. Volcanic eruptions are hot work, especially on an August afternoon, and little Eddie and the boys had worked up a thirst. They headed inside to find their mom chatting over a cup of coffee with the minister. Each one grabbed a chipped cup or an old mason jar and filled it from the sink. They dropped into chairs around the kitchen table and tried not to interrupt. But it didn't last long. Baby Gray got restless and toddled out onto the back porch. In a minute, he toddled back in. He pulled on his mama's sleeve and looked anxiously up into her face. "Mama," he said, "Smoke in the window." "Honey," said his mother, "don't interrupt me when I'm talking to the preacher." Well, Gray was an obedient little boy. He didn't interrupt any more, but he wandered back out to the porch. When the preacher had finished his coffee and said his goodbyes, the boy's mother stepped out on the back porch to collect laundry from the wringer washer. In less than a second, the door banged open, and she yelled, "Smoke! There's smoke coming out of the attic window!" Little Eddie and the boys stampeded through the door and looked up at the attic window. Sure enough, there was a thick cloud of dark smoke pouring through the upstairs window. Immediately, little Eddie grabbed the bucket that was lying beside the volcano and headed back into the kitchen. It seemed to take forever to fill at the sink, but finally he dashed to the door to the attic steps and he jerked it open. A blast of heat struck him in the face, and he stared into a roiling holocaust of flame. With a heave, he flung the bucket of water up the stairway, but it only sizzled. A tongue of fire began to spread across the yellowed wallpaper of the kitchen ceiling. Forget the attic. It was now every man for himself. Little Eddie ran to the boys' bedroom. They all shared a dresser, and Eddie's clothes were in the top drawer. He didn't have time to run down the hall. Every second was precious, so he grabbed a chair and did something he'd always wanted to do. He threw it right through the window. His drawer, full of clothes, followed close behind. But just as he was reaching for Scotty's drawer, he remembered his new fishing pole. He couldn't let it burn up. Meanwhile, Scotty had run to the living room and was selflessly rescuing the set of Encyclopedia Britannica, one armload at a time. Neighbors began to gather. A young Marine, home on furlough, and another gentleman hauled the Steinway upright piano through the front doors, manhandled it down the stairs, and left it propped against one of the large maple trees by the gate. Little Eddie's figured his dad might have done it himself, but he was at a meeting in Charleston for the day. Burning chunks of ceiling began to drop into the hallway, and the tar paper on the roof had become a black Niagara Falls. The boy's mom refused to let them go back inside. A fire truck had been called from Whitesville, 20 miles away, and by the time it arrived, the back half of the house was ablaze. Firemen leapt out and cranked up the pump on their tanker truck. They began to direct a steady stream of water onto the roof. More neighbors arrived. Little Eddie added to the festive occasion by sitting down at the piano and playing ragtime music. Everything appeared to be under control. Until the tanker truck went dry. The firemen glanced about, but they weren't surprised not to find a hydrant in Rockcastle Holler. No problem. They were prepared. In a moment, 2 burly firemen were lugging a portable pump down the hill, through the strawberry patch, across the railroad tracks to the riverbank. They connected a hose, and in minutes, a fresh stream of water was being directed to the roof, or what was left of it. Eddie started to play again. Just then, a far-off sound reached their ears. It was strangely familiar. Following the direction of the sound, their eyes went down the hill, through the strawberry patch, to the railroad tracks. That's what makes a noise like that. A train whistle. Sure enough, the 5:15 train, loaded with over 100 cars of coal, was barreling down the stretch. Then everyone's eyes followed the fire hose as it went down the hill, through the strawberry patch, and across the railroad tracks. Well, there's no way to stop a fully loaded coal train traveling at 50 miles an hour in less than a mile and a half. Certainly not before it ran over the fire hose, slicing it cleanly in two. On one side of the tracks, the cut hose thrashed about, spraying water in all directions. On the other side, the fireman directing the nozzle watched his stream of water die away to nothing. Any hopes to save the house died with it. By the time the hose was spliced, the house was gone. 6 steps climbed bravely to where the front porch had been and gave way to a smoking ash heap. The chimney stood sadly off to one side. A kind neighbor lady put her arm around the boy's mother, invited them to walk down the hill to her house for some supper. No one was home when little Eddie's father arrived. He pulled up to the empty lot where his home had been. There was a piano under the maple tree, but that was about it. Getting out of the car, he followed the walkway to the front steps. He circled the ash heap, passing the chimney. He made his way to the backyard and saw something that puzzled him. There, not 20 feet from the smoldering remains of his home, was a small volcano, purple lava, still cooling on its sides. He looked back at the ashes of his home and then turned to stare again at the volcano. He scratched his head in wonder. Could it be? Could it really be?